She was dragged behind a horse for refusing marriage, until a rancher shot the rope. Emily had grown up on a sprawling ranch surrounded by wide-open fields and the comforting hum of cattle grazing. Her father, a respected man in their small frontier town, ran the land with a firm yet fair hand. Life was simple, with hard work shaping the rhythm of every day. From an early age, Emily had been taught to ride horses, tend to the livestock, and take care of the ranch alongside her father. The land was in her blood, and it was where she felt most at home. But there was something else about Emily that made her different from most young women in town. She had dreams that stretched far beyond the borders of her father's ranch and the dusty roads of the town they lived in. Her father, John Wheeler, was a practical man. He had always wanted the best for Emily, but he had a hard time understanding her dreams. He believed that a good, stable marriage to a man with wealth and influence was the most secure future a woman could hope for. It was a belief rooted in tradition, and he had been raised to value those traditions above all else. So, when Jeremiah Blackwood, a powerful landowner from a nearby town, came to him with a proposal, John saw an opportunity. Blackwood's offer wasn't just about marriage. It was about aligning their two lands, bringing more cattle to their herds, and cementing a powerful connection that would benefit both families. Jeremiah Blackwood wasn't a man you could easily say no to. He had built his wealth through ruthless business dealings, and his reputation was one of both respect and fear. He had power, more power than most people in the area, and his land stretched for miles. His dark eyes held a certain coldness, and when he spoke, it was with the weight of authority. John Wheeler knew that a union with Blackwood could solidify his daughter's future, and he believed that Emily, though strong-willed, would come to see the value in such an arrangement. So, when Blackwood's men came to speak with him about the proposal, John agreed, not considering the possibility that Emily might have her own ideas about the matter. The first time Emily heard about the proposal, she was working in the barn, her hands covered in hay and dust from the day's chores. Her father had always trusted her to help him with the ranch work, and Emily had learned everything there was to know about running a ranch. She had worked harder than most men, earning a reputation for her determination and strength. So, when her father asked her to come inside, she thought nothing of it. But when she stepped into the house, her father was sitting at the kitchen table, a look of concern in his eyes. The air felt thick, and Emily could sense that something was off. When he mentioned Jeremiah Blackwood, she raised an eyebrow, confused. Her father went on to explain that Blackwood had made an offer, one that he thought Emily should seriously consider. It was a marriage proposal, but it wasn't just about love. It was about securing their future, about bringing two families together to form a powerful alliance. Emily's heart sank as she listened to her father speak. She had never been in love with Jeremiah Blackwood, and she didn't want to be married off to him just because it was a good business deal. "I know this may seem sudden, Emily," her father said gently. "But it's a good match. Blackwood is a powerful man, and his lands will help us grow. Think of it as an opportunity, a chance for you to have everything you've ever dreamed of." Emily stared at her father, her mind racing. She loved her father and she respected him, but this wasn't what she wanted. She had always been determined to make her own decisions, to choose her own path. The thought of being married to a man she didn't love, to living a life dictated by someone else's wishes, made her feel trapped. She had her own dreams of running the ranch, of having her own land, her own future. Jeremiah Blackwood didn't fit into that future. "I won't marry him," Emily said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Her father's face fell, and he tried to reason with her. He told her that it was her duty, that this was what was expected of her. He reminded her that she had a responsibility to the family and the ranch. He painted a picture of the comfortable life she would have, of the security and wealth that would come with the marriage. But none of it appealed to Emily. The more her father spoke, the more determined she became to stand her ground. She didn't want to live a life based on expectations. She wanted to live a life based on her own choices. "I understand, but I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I won't marry him, Father." Emily could see the disappointment in her father's eyes, but she couldn't back down. She had always believed in following her heart, and right now her heart was telling her that this was wrong. She couldn't marry someone just because it was convenient or expected. She would not let anyone make that decision for her. Later that night, as Emily lay in her bed, her mind kept turning over the conversation with her father. She thought about what would happen next. Would her father try to force her into the marriage? Would Blackwood take matters into his own hands? Emily knew the kind of man Blackwood was. He was not accustomed to being refused, and he didn't take rejection lightly. She wondered what he would do when he heard that she had turned him down. The next morning, Emily went about her usual routine, but there was an unease in the air. Her father's silence weighed heavily on her, and she could feel the tension building. Jeremiah Blackwood had made it clear that he expected an answer, and now he would get one. But Emily didn't know if she was prepared for what would happen when she stood firm in her refusal. She only knew that she couldn't back down. As the day wore on, Emily could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her. Word of her refusal had spread quickly, and there were whispers wherever she went. Most of the town respected her father and knew that this marriage would benefit the ranch, but Emily's refusal was a slap in the face to Blackwood. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had made a powerful enemy. Jeremiah Blackwood wouldn't take this lightly, and he would make sure that everyone knew the price of defying him. The days following Emily's refusal were tense. Every corner of the small town seemed to hum with the buzz of rumors. People whispered when she passed by, casting quick glances her way. Emily had always been known for her independence, her sharp wit, and her refusal to be confined by anyone's expectations. But this was different. Refusing to marry Jeremiah Blackwood was more than just defying an old tradition. It was a challenge to Blackwood himself, and he would not take it lightly. Her father, John, seemed torn. He knew the power Blackwood held, and Emily's rejection of him would bring consequences. The rancher's offer had been one that promised a prosperous future, and now Emily's decision had put that future at risk. The weeks passed slowly, with Emily noticing the distance growing between her and her father. Though he loved her, there was an unspoken tension in the air whenever they spoke. John knew that Blackwood's influence stretched far beyond their little town, and he feared the kind of retaliation that might come. Blackwood, on the other hand, did not hide his anger. It was clear that he expected Emily to come around, to change her mind, and to see the benefit of marrying him. But when Emily stood firm, Blackwood's patience began to wear thin. He could not bear the thought of a young woman refusing him, especially in front of his men in the town. He was a man of power, a man who had built his empire on the strength of his will, and Emily's defiance seemed like a challenge to everything he had worked for. It was not just about the marriage anymore. It was about control, about asserting dominance. One afternoon, as Emily worked in the barn, she heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. At first, she didn't think much of it. The ranch was a busy place, with people coming and going throughout the day. But when she looked up, her heart sank. It was Blackwood's men, and they were riding fast, their horses kicking up dust as they came to a halt outside the barn. Emily's father, John, stepped out from the house, his face pale as he greeted them. Emily knew instantly that something was wrong. She could see it in her father's eyes, the worry, the fear. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it had arrived, he wasn't sure how to handle it. "Emily," her father said, his voice shaking slightly, "Blackwood's men are here. They want to speak to you." She had known something like this would happen, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. She walked toward the front of the house where the men waited. Their faces were grim, and there was a coldness in their eyes as they looked at her. They didn't speak a word, but instead motioned for her to come closer. Emily's heart raced. She had never been one to cower in the face of authority, but now, with Blackwood's men standing before her, she felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. "We've come to deliver a message from Mr. Blackwood," one of the men said, his voice low and firm. "He expects an answer, Miss Wheeler. You'll either accept his offer, or there will be consequences." Emily's stomach turned. She had expected this, but the reality of the situation was worse than she had imagined. There was no room for negotiation, no space for compromise. Blackwood was not asking for her agreement. He was demanding it. And if she refused again, she knew the consequences would not be pleasant. "I've already given my answer," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. I will not marry him, and I won't change my mind." The man who had spoken before gave a slight nod to the others, and without a word they dismounted from their horses. Emily could see the muscles in their arms tense as they moved toward her. The sight sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just about a marriage anymore, it was about control, about teaching her a lesson she wouldn't forget. Before she could react, one of the men grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly toward the back of the barn. Emily tried to pull away, but the man's grip was too strong. "You're coming with us," he said, his tone harsh. "Blackwood's orders!" "Let me go!" Emily shouted, but the man didn't loosen his hold. She struggled to break free, but it was useless. The more she fought, the tighter his grip became. She looked toward her father, hoping for some sign that he would intervene, but John stood frozen, unable to move. He had no choice but to watch as his daughter was dragged away. The men didn't take her far, just behind the barn where the other horses were waiting. There, they tied a thick rope around her wrists, securing her tightly to one of the horses. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what they were about to do. This was no longer a simple demand. It was punishment. It was a way to break her, to force her to submit to Blackwood's will. "Please don't!" Emily begged, her voice trembling. "I won't marry him! I won't!" But her words were met with silence. The men didn't speak, didn't answer. They simply climbed onto their horses, and with a sharp command, the horse began to move. Emily was yanked forward, her feet dragging across the dirt. The pain was immediate. Her body was jerked and pulled with every step the horse took. She gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out, but the agony was overwhelming. The rough ground scraped against her skin, and she could feel the rope digging into her wrists as it pulled taut. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was nowhere to run. She was at the mercy of Blackwood's men, and they had no intention of showing mercy. The town was silent, watching from a distance but too afraid to intervene. Emily's heart ached, not just from the pain, but from the crushing realization that no one would come to her aid. Not even her father! As the horse continued to pull her, Emily's world became a blur of pain and dust. She tried to focus on anything to distract her from the agony, but all she could hear was the pounding of the horse's hooves, each step a reminder of how powerless she had become. Her mind kept drifting back to her father's face, to the look of disappointment in his eyes. He had wanted her to submit, to follow the path he had set out for her, but Emily knew she could never do that. Not now, not ever. The world seemed to grow darker with every passing moment, and Emily felt herself growing weaker, her body struggling to keep up with the pace of the horse. But just when she thought she could go no further, she heard a sharp sound. The men who had been dragging her stopped, their horses jerking to a halt. Emily looked up, confused, her mind still clouded by the pain. And then she saw him. Thomas, the rancher from the outskirts of town, standing with a rifle in his hands, his eyes locked on the men who had bound her. He had come to her rescue, and in that moment, everything changed. The dust in the air settled slowly as Emily lay there on the ground, her body bruised, her wrists still tied tightly to the rope that had dragged her across the dirt. Her mind was a whirl of confusion and pain, but there was something else now, a small flicker of hope. She hadn't expected anyone to intervene. The town had always been a place where people kept to themselves, where they followed the rules and lived in fear of the powerful men who ran things. But now, as she tried to catch her breath, she realized that the silence was broken. The loud crack of the rifle's shot echoed through the valley, followed by the sound of hooves skidding to a halt. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she turned her head, trying to focus on the figure that had appeared from the distance. It was a man, someone she didn't recognize at first, standing tall and steady, with a rifle aimed at the men who had been dragging her behind the horse. Her vision blurred, but there was no mistaking it now. Someone was here to help. Someone was standing up to Blackwood's men! The men who had been pulling her stopped immediately, their horses jerking back as the tension in the air grew thick. They hadn't expected this. None of them had. They had all been so sure that their actions would go unchecked, that Emily would submit, just like everyone else had when it came to Blackwood. But now, with a shot fired and a rancher standing tall with a rifle in his hands, the situation had changed. And for the first time since this began, Emily allowed herself a small breath of relief. "Let her go," the rancher's voice rang out, calm but firm. There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. His eyes were locked on the men, unblinking and steady. Emily had never seen him before, but there was something familiar about him, something reassuring. He wasn't like Blackwood's men, who relied on brute strength to get what they wanted. This man carried himself differently, as though he had seen much more than his fair share of trouble and had learned how to handle it. The men on horseback hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances. They had been hired by Blackwood to teach Emily a lesson, and they weren't about to back down easily. But the sight of the rifle in the rancher's hands made them pause. The rifle was aimed at them, not in a threatening way, but in a way that said clearly, "I won't hesitate to shoot if you don't leave her alone." "Didn't think anyone would care enough to stop this," one of the men muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with both annoyance and fear. "Get back," the rancher said again, his eyes hardening. "This is your only warning." For a long moment, the two sides stood locked in a tense standoff. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest, and though she couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, she knew one thing for sure. This man was not going to let them hurt her anymore. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, and Emily could feel the rope pulling against her wrists, still tied to the horse. She wanted to move, to stand up, to run away, but her body was too weak. The pain from the drag had left her drained, and her hands were sore and raw. She glanced at the rancher, her eyes wide, and though she didn't know what to say, she found herself silently thanking him for his intervention. Finally, the tension broke. The first man turned his horse away, growling under his breath. "Blackwood's going to hear about this," he warned, his voice filled with venom. The rancher didn't respond. He simply kept his rifle steady, his eyes never leaving the men. They didn't waste any more time. With another hard look at Emily, they rode off into the distance, their hooves fading into the quiet afternoon. As the last of the men disappeared from sight, Emily let out a long, shaky breath. She was free, at least for now. Her body still ached, and her mind was racing with thoughts she couldn't fully grasp. But the immediate danger had passed. The rancher lowered his rifle, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Emily felt a sense of relief settle in her chest. The rancher walked over to her, his boots kicking up dirt with each step. He moved with a calm confidence, the kind of calm that comes with knowing exactly what to do in dangerous situations. He knelt beside her, and for the first time, she saw the warmth in his eyes. He wasn't just some stranger coming to her aid. There was something about him that made her feel safe, even in such a terrible moment. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, though still full of authority. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but found her throat dry, her voice weak. She couldn't find the words at first, so she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his. "The rancher didn't waste any time. He untied the rope that bound her wrists, and the release brought a sense of immediate relief." Emily winced as her hands were freed, the pain from the tightrope fading with each passing second. Her wrists were raw and bruised, but at least they were no longer tied to the horse. "Thank you," Emily finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from the struggle. The rancher gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're welcome, but you should get up. We can't stay here long." Emily blinked, still struggling to fully process everything that had just happened. Her mind was racing, jumping from one thought to the next. Who was this man? Why had he stepped in? And what would happen now? "My name's Thomas," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Thomas Moore. I live just outside of town. Saw what was happening from a distance and couldn't stand by." Emily tried to sit up, her muscles still stiff from the ordeal. She looked at him, still trying to understand everything. "Why did you help me?" Thomas seemed to consider her question for a moment. "I couldn't watch a woman be treated that way. No one deserves that, especially not someone who's just standing up for what's right." His words hit her like a wave. Standing up for what's right. She had felt so alone, so trapped in her refusal. And now this man, this stranger, had risked his life to save her. Emily felt a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude and respect for him, though she couldn't quite express it. "Where are they going?" Emily finally asked, her voice still shaky. "What happens now?"
"For now, we get you out of here. You're not safe here anymore, not with Blackwood's men after you. We'll get you to a place where you can rest and figure out your next move."
She was unsteady at first, but soon enough her legs held her steady. Her body still ached, but the warmth of the sun on her face and the kindness of this stranger gave her a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, a sense of hope. The tension in the air remained thick as Thomas helped Emily up from the dirt. Though she was free from the ropes that had bound her wrists, the feeling of being free, truly free, was something she had never experienced before. The world around her had always been defined by other people's expectations, especially those of her father and the powerful landowners like Jeremiah Blackwood.
For the first time, Emily was standing on her own 2 feet, free to make her own decisions, even if it was uncertain what those decisions would be. Thomas didn't rush her, giving her a moment to steady herself.
He could tell that she was shaken, not just from the physical pain of the ordeal, but from the emotional weight of everything that had happened. As he looked at her, he saw more than just a young woman who had been mistreated. He saw someone with strength, someone who had stood up for herself in a world that often made it hard for women to do so. He respected that. Emily took a few steps, still wincing from the soreness in her legs and arms. But the more she walked, the more her body began to loosen up, the more her mind started to clear. She could still feel the sting of the rope on her wrists, the soreness in her chest from the way she had been dragged, but with each step she felt more grounded. The thought of what might come next, of how Blackwood might retaliate, still loomed in the back of her mind.
But for now, she was safe. For now, she was with someone who cared enough to intervene.
"You should ride with me," Thomas said after a moment, noticing her hesitation. "I've got a horse just up ahead." "We'll make sure no one follows." Emily nodded, grateful for his calm and practical nature. She had no idea where to go, no plan of her own, but for the first time, it didn't feel like she was completely alone.
Thomas had given her a chance, a small window of opportunity to figure things out, and she was determined to take it. Together they walked through the field, the tall grass brushing against their legs.
Emily's mind raced, her thoughts jumping from one worry to the next. She was still afraid of Blackwood's wrath, still uncertain about what would happen when the town learned what had occurred.
Her refusal to marry Jeremiah Blackwood would not go unnoticed. He would make sure of that.
The town had always been small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. In a way, it was comforting to know that people cared enough to notice what was going on in each other's lives. But in another way, it made her feel trapped. She could already imagine the whispers and stares that would follow her wherever she went.
No matter where she went next, no matter how far she ran, there would always be someone who remembered her as the woman who defied Blackwood.
When they reached the horse, Emily couldn't help but be impressed. It was a strong-looking animal, its coat dark and shiny, its eyes alert and watchful. Thomas helped her mount, his hands steady and gentle as he guided her onto the saddle. Once she was settled, she glanced at him, her heart still racing, unsure of where they would go from here. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small but firm. The uncertainty of her situation weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't afford to seem weak now, not when she had come this far. Thomas mounted his own horse, his eyes scanning the horizon before turning to face her. "We'll head to my place for now."
"It's not far, and it's safe. No one knows about it except a few people. You can rest there. Think things through."
Emily nodded, trusting him for the moment. The journey to his place was quiet, just the sound of hooves on the ground and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Emily tried to relax as they rode, but her mind kept returning to Blackwood. What would he do? Would he come after her?
And what about her father? She knew her refusal had broken her father's heart, and she wasn't sure how he would react to her leaving with Thomas.
As they rode on, Emily couldn't help but think of the life she had been living. One filled with expectations, with people trying to control her every move. It wasn't that she didn't love her father.
She did.
But the idea of marrying Blackwood, of living a life dictated by his wealth and influence, made her feel like a prisoner. She had always dreamed of a different life, one where she could make her own choices, follow her own path. Now she was living that dream. But it came at a cost. When they arrived at Thomas's place, Emily was surprised to see how peaceful it was. It was a modest ranch, much smaller than her father's, but there was something comforting about the simplicity of it. The land was quiet, the house tucked away from the main road, surrounded by trees and fields. It was the kind of place that felt like it could offer safety, a place where she could breathe and think clearly without the pressure of Blackwood's threats looming over her. "Here we are," Thomas said, guiding her toward a small stable where he tied up his horse. Emily dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. She looked around, taking in the peaceful surroundings. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice quieter now. Thomas nodded, leading her toward the house. "It's been in my family for years.
Not much to it, but it's home."
As they walked into the house, Emily was surprised at how warm and inviting it felt.
It was simple, but it was a place where people could rest, where they could feel safe. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and there was a small fire burning in the hearth, adding a cozy glow to the room.
There were no grand furnishings, no signs of wealth. But there was a sense of peace here, something that felt right in the midst of all the chaos she had just been through.
Thomas offered her a seat by the fire.
"You look like you could use some rest." "I'll make us something to eat."
Emily sat down, grateful for the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the quiet room. As Thomas went to work in the kitchen, Emily allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. Her thoughts were still racing, still worried about what would come next, but for now, she was safe. For now, she didn't have to worry about Blackwood's men or the town's judgment. She could breathe. She could think. It was strange how much had changed in such a short time. Just hours ago, she had been dragged across the ground, bound and helpless. But now, sitting here in Thomas's modest home, she realized that she was no longer the same person. She had made a choice, a hard choice, but one that had freed her from the life she had been forced into. And now she was free to decide what came next. As Thomas placed a simple meal in front of her, Emily smiled, grateful not only for the food, but for the chance to start over. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. And that was something she had never been given before. Days passed, and Emily found herself adjusting to the peace that surrounded Thomas's ranch. The quiet was a stark contrast to the life she had known, a life full of noise, expectations, and constant pressure. But here at Thomas's modest ranch, the days felt slower, more deliberate. The world felt bigger in a way, as if the horizon extended endlessly and the weight of her past life had been lifted, if only for a moment. There was a sense of freedom here, one that Emily had never experienced before. Each day, she worked alongside Thomas, helping with the chores, feeding the animals and learning the ins and outs of ranch life from someone who was more than capable of teaching her. Thomas was kind, patient, and steady, never rushing her, never asking for more than she could give. The more time Emily spent with him, the more she began to see the depth of his character. He wasn't like the men she had known. He didn't use his strength to intimidate others, and he didn't expect things to be handed to him. He worked hard, quietly, and without complaint, as if the land and the animals were his true companions. At first, Emily had felt like an outsider in his world, unsure of how to fit in, unsure of where she belonged. But over time, she began to realize that she didn't need to fit in. She didn't need to mold herself into someone else's expectations. For the first time, Emily could be herself, without worrying about pleasing anyone or following someone else's plan. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't used to, but it was a feeling that slowly grew on her, like the warmth of the sun on her skin. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas and Emily sat by the fire in the small cabin. The night had settled in, and the stars above were so clear that it felt like they could reach out and touch them. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. It had been a long day, and her body was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from hard work, from knowing that she had accomplished something. Thomas sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the fire. There was a quiet strength about him, one that was not boastful or loud, but steady and reassuring. Emily had always admired that kind of strength, the kind that didn't need to be proven or explained. It was simply there, in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself.
"You've got a good life here, Thomas," Emily said after a moment of silence, her voice soft. "I never really understood what it meant to live like this, to live in the moment and work with the land, but now I see it." There was a warmth in his gaze, something that made Emily feel as though she had finally found a place where she belonged. "It's not much, but it's mine," he said simply. "And I'm glad you're here. You've got a good heart, Emily. You've always known what's right, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise." Emily looked down at her hands, her fingers still a little raw from the ropes. "I never felt like I had a choice," she said quietly. "Everything was always decided for me. What I should do, who I should marry, how I should live. It was never my choice. But now I get to choose." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" he said, his voice low. "Choosing for yourself, especially when everyone else has already decided for you." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "I don't know where my life goes from here, but for the first time I feel like I can figure that out. On my own." Thomas smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You've always had that strength in you, Emily. You just needed the chance to find it. And I think you're going to be just fine." Emily felt a rush of emotion at his words. She had spent so long doubting herself, questioning whether she was strong enough, brave enough to make the kind of choices that would lead her to a better life. But here, with Thomas, she felt like she could finally breathe. She could finally see a future where she was the one in control, where she didn't have to live in fear of what others would think or expect from her. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to feel more and more at home on Thomas's ranch. She had made a life for herself here, and it was a simple one, but it was hers. She had learned to appreciate the little things, the sound of the wind in the trees, the scent of fresh bread baking in the oven, the feeling of the earth beneath her feet. And slowly she began to heal, not just from the physical pain the Blackwood's men had caused her, but from the emotional scars that had been left by the life she had tried to escape. One day, after a particularly long day of work, Thomas and Emily sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the cool evening air was a welcome relief after the heat of the day. Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed as she listened to the sounds of the evening settling in around them. She felt at peace, something she had never felt before. The tension that had been in her body for so long had finally started to fade away. "I'm glad you came for me that day," Emily said, her voice soft. "I don't think I could have made it on my own." Thomas didn't say anything at first, just sat quietly next to her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. After a moment he turned to her, his face thoughtful. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You didn't need me to save you. You were already saving yourself. You just didn't know it yet." Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of his words settle deep in her heart. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had truly found a place where she belonged, a place where she could be herself without fear or judgment. And with Thomas by her side, she knew that no matter what the future held, she would be able to face it on her own terms. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to plan her future. She wasn't sure exactly what it would look like, but for the first time, she knew that it was hers to shape. She didn't need to marry Blackwood, and she didn't need to follow the rules that had been set for her by others. She could choose her own path, one step at a time. As the seasons changed, so did Emily. She had found a strength within herself that she never knew existed. And she had learned that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead to the greatest freedom. And with that freedom, she knew that she could face anything that came her way.